Okay, hello there. One of my viewers, he asked me to make a video about topics or the world situation today. I said, well, that's a little too, I said something like, it's a little too wide, it's too wide of a topic. I mean, you cannot, it's too much to make a video about foreign affairs, the gay rights movement, abortion, the power of the US government versus state governments, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's just too much. The likelihood of the Dallas Cowboys going to the Super Bowl this year, which actually I'm predicting that to happen. But I figured since the Confederate flag issue is like the big issue right now, or one of the big issues, you could also mention the Iranian nuclear program situation. But so the Confederate flag issue is a big deal. And before I get into all of it, and I invited everybody, like all my friends, acquaintances, whatever. I don't know, in Google, you got these different categories. I just invited everybody just in case somebody wanted to join and talk about it. I think a lot of people are reluctant to discuss it because they are concerned that if they fall down on the wrong side of the issue or the wrong side of history, as our Marxist friends like to always say, that they could face too much persecution in the land of the free or consequences of speech. So, but they oftentimes will come to me in private and say things. Actually, I get that in all different walks of life, people coming to me saying, well, you know, this is what I think about it. But they would be reluctant to say it. At this time, they're reluctant to say it publicly. But I get a lot of underneath commentary that's almost always pro-Confederate flag. But, you know, after the war between the states ended in 1865, and someone pointed out last night, he said, well, that flag represents the side that lost. There's no argument about that. I mean, you would have to live in a world of complete fantasy not to understand that. I don't know if that means that it's a dishonorable thing. Sometimes countries lose wars. It doesn't mean they're bad. Poland lost to the German invaders and then later to the Soviet invaders on September 17th when they came in from the east. And, you know, they lost, and the Polish flag represented the flag of a country that lost. I don't think people should make fun of Poland. France lost the war to Germany in 1940 and they surrendered. I don't think we should be making fun of France. People lose, people win. But and this video is not really about the merits or the demerits of the Confederate flag, actually. But after the war, people were saying, oh, it's too bad we lost. But you even had Confederate leaders like Jefferson Davis, for instance, and the president, and Robert E. Lee. They were saying, well, it's a shame we lost, you know, all that, but may as well just try to make the best of it, go along with this situation. And I live in America, okay? I understand the stars and stripes fly over the buildings. It is what it is. No use crying about it. But because the Southerners, almost all of them, thought that, or at least the white Southerners, or right, the white Democrats thought that the South was right. They were so traumatized by losing so many hundreds of thousands of soldiers that they built monuments in pretty much practically every Southern former Confederate town across the South, and they flew the Confederate flag off and on in different areas. For the 100th anniversary of the war in the 1950s, as that approached, they started to fly flags in Georgia. Georgia actually changed their state flag with the Confederate battle flag incorporated into their flag, sort of a memorial. It did happen around the same time as the civil rights movement was really getting going, and people said, well, they were really fighting against, that was a sign that they were fighting against the civil rights movement. I wouldn't necessarily say that's wrong, because the Southern Democrats generally opposed the civil rights movement. So it could have been a double meaning. Anyway, there wasn't really any desire to take those things down. There was, now, as the, you started having more agitation from your liberal left, not to say liberals, but the liberal left, the Marxist-oriented organizations, which to a large extent influenced and even helped create the civil rights movement. If you look at the founders of the NAACP, for instance, many of them, if you cross-reference them, they had involvement in socialist, oriented organizations. And this was the case all the way through with, Martin Luther King's top advisor, Hunter Pitts Odell, one of his top advisors. He's still alive today. Jack Odell is another name he used. So there's certainly a relationship with Marxism and civil rights movement. It's not a complete, total relationship. It is a fairly close relationship. But they were more agitative towards it. But really, before 1982, you didn't really hear much about that. In 1982, the NAACP decided they wanted all Confederate symbols removed. They made a big push at University of Mississippi, and there was a big uproar there. Most people probably didn't pay any mind to it, but the University of Mississippi did take down the little Confederate officer guy, on the helmet and wore the gray uniform, and they kept the name rebels, but they started to discourage students from waving the battle flag, which was always done over there. That was like a common thing. And they didn't want to do it, and then they tried to use all these crazy rules, like you can't have a flag with a stick at the game because you could poke somebody in the eye. But it was obviously a bogus argument because they always had sticks. It was just trying to discourage it. And then they came out with this M flag with the letter M on it that looked like a sort of like a stylized Confederate type thing, and it still didn't sit well with a lot of people. And but University of Mississippi administration tended to be very liberal. Left liberal, I don't mean just like libertarian liberal, So, well, then Georgia, you had people within the state government saying, oh, due to agitation, you understand. Before the agitation, there was indifference to it. But when you had the agitation and all of this, then the governor of Georgia, he destroyed his political career doing this, by the way, but they took down the battle flag version of the Georgia state flag and then put up a temporary flag, and then in 2003 adopted the current Georgia state flag, which is very similar to the first Confederate flag, which actually went back to the pre-1956 flag, which was sort of a recreation of the Confederate, original Confederate flag. All right, so they took that, they changed that flag. Alabama agreed to take the battle flag off their state capital, and South Carolina did, and moved the battle flag to the state grounds, the Capitol grounds at the Confederate Memorial, and Alabama flew the 4 Confederate flags at their state memorial. Then that sort of died down and was kind of forgotten. There are other things to deal with in the world. But then this guy, pretty obviously mentally disturbed guy, sort of a Charles Manson type, raised with a really bad family background, psychopathic type tendencies, kind of a fit the profile of your mass murderer type person, loner male. They tend to have a profile. Profiling is very helpful in crime fighting, by the way, whether it's racial or whatever social or cultural attribute you use, it tends to be helpful. But and he was actually telling people he was going to do it, but no one did anything. And then he legally bought a gun. It was actually illegally bought a gun, but the enforcement agencies weren't checking properly. No shock there. Not to say you couldn't have illegally purchased a gun. I don't think that's very difficult to do. But he murdered 9 people, allegedly. I mean, they're going to have a trial. We can't, he's innocent until proven guilty, but I think the trial is going to determine he was guilty. And then all of a sudden, I said, oh, this is bad. You know, this is a terrible thing. And then I saw the next day, they showed photos of him wearing the flag of Rhodesia, the flag from 1970 to 79. And then he was wearing the Confederate battle flag. And I said, okay, I know what's coming next. I mean, I just knew. I've been monitoring the left for 30 something years. So I knew. And then they said on CBS Morning News, John Stewart Leibowitz, but his stage name is John Stewart. So John Leibowitz came on there and he says, oh, I'm not going to talk about politics tonight, but I will mention that South Carolina has the Confederate flag flying. And then he went on this big rant about politics for a long time. But of course he was going to talk about politics. So I said, well, I know across the board, there'll be a uniformed call from the left, you know, Marxist left groups to get rid of all Confederate symbolism. You know, you know how they work. Always know what the left is going to say before they say it. It helps to learn about them because you can really kind of predict, you know, their movements. And it's good to know the enemy and how they're going to, you know, operate. This is a smart thing to do. So, and I said, well, they're going to go after these Republican leaders in the South, white Republican leaders, or in Nimrata Haley, Nikki Haley, her stage name, but Nimrata Haley's case, some sort of race, you know, but I mean, you know, leaders of the white conservative, you know, remember it used to be Southern Democrats. Now, since the Eisenhower-Nixon days, it became white Republicans. They were able to pull off a pretty impressive operation by getting all the white, pretty much the whole white South, conservative-oriented Southerners to switch parties between 1956 and 1996. And you just knew that those people would start to crack because they're very shaky to start with. Most of those, yeah, I would say most of the white Republican leadership, they're nominally conservative. They're dedicated politicians, there's no doubt. Their main goal is to get elected and reelected. That's a good career. And if you're not, you know, very work oriented and you like to eat big meals. So people, you know, the world of politics attracts people like that, people without morals, opportunist type, you know, the type. We all meet these kind of people. They say what sounds good. They don't have really any personal convictions. If this whole group of people like Nimrata Haley and Robert Brantley in Alabama, if they thought that being liberal would advance their career, then on a dime, they would be, you know, more left-wing than Jerry Rubin and Jane Fonda. I mean, that's the group you're dealing with. So I thought predictably they'll start saying, oh, you know, they'll make these emotional appeals to pander to the audience and say, we need to take it down. You know, what if they would speak the truth, they would say stuff like, I have no personal convictions. And before this murder, I was totally indifferent to the Confederate flag and symbols, or maybe even possibly favorable towards it. But now it seems that it would be advantageous for my political career that I would be against it. Okay, these are the, you know, the Pierre Laval type mindset. They go with whoever's in control. Pierre Laval was the dedicated communist, and then, oh, well, no, he was going to fight for France. But no, now actually he was pro-Hitler. You know, he was whatever he needed to be to stay in power. He just wound up on the wrong side of the fight. But that's how these guys are. So you saw this happening across South. Now with Mitch Landrieu, the mayor of New Orleans, you can't say he betrayed his principles because his principles were always left, liberal left, international socialist principles, his father and his sister. So he was a liberal, talking about a left liberal acting the way you would expect. So if a Marxist pulls out a red hammer and sickle flag and sings the Internationale, you don't get offended so much because you expect them to do that. You get a little more aggravated when the person on the right turns out to be only nominally right wing and they pander to the left for expediency. So that's always very irritating, although it's predictable. Now, in Alabama, there was supposedly the governor had the right by executive power to control what flags flew on the Confederate memorial there. So they, in a very dishonorable way, took the flags down. If you saw the video, it was very bad. Insulting. He'll have no future in Alabama. He's 70-something years old. He doesn't care. He'll get his retirement check. Nimrata Haley, she had a little more class. I'm not saying she has class. I'm saying she had a little more class in how that banner was removed with an honor guard and all that. She probably won't. She probably has no political career either. She may get a Republican liberal nominee to tap her politically. I'm trying to say for vice president. Say like a Jeb Bush type setup. But Louisiana is a little harder. You know, Mississippi is going to be a hard nut to crack because the people aren't going to vote for it. So they could never put up to a referendum. And the state government, it could be hard to get that passed to the legislature to change that flag. You know, they got the Confederate battle flag. This flag is part of the Mississippi state flag. You know, I'm talking about the square banner that was designed by P.G.T. Beauregard and assistants, his assistants. They did that flag to make it distinctive during the battle because actually the original flag you see was this. And it was very popular in the South. But during the battle, when the wind was blowing and it had clouds, it looked so similar to the U.S. flag that you had situations where U.S. troops were firing on their own side, and Confederate troops firing on their own troops, other troops, because the flag was so indistinguishable from the original U.S. flag that it was causing a problem. So P.G.T. Beauregard of Louisiana, in fact, he said we ought to come up with a flag that's more distinguishable on the battlefield. And that's why they came up with that X flag, modeled after the St. Andrew's Cross of Scotland. That became like the famous Confederate flag after a while, and it was incorporated into the national flag in 1863, and then, like I said, the state flag of Mississippi, and the state flag of Alabama and Florida sort of followed it in a style, you know, with that St. Andrew's cross, even till today. And then Arkansas kind of modeled their flag on it in a very loose way, and Tennessee also in a very, very loose way, not really similar. Louisiana never did. They always had the pelican flag, which had no relation to the Confederacy at all, in fact. The original Confederate flag still flies in state government buildings in Louisiana and Texas. I'm not going to say where because I'm not going to help the enemy, but it does, in fact. Even churches. Anyway, the big argument is about slavery. You know, that's like the flashpoint word. And they'll say it represents slavery. The answer to that is yes and no. And there has to be some logical, you know, when people are all emotional and they don't think and they scream and holler, and that's a attribute of the left, you know. But you get right-wing people too that, you know, they lean right-wing, but they don't know history. The history they do know, they don't understand it. And you have those sloganeering people too. They like to put up bumper stickers, put posts on Facebook, but they couldn't really, you know, clearly explain their reasons for anything. You know, they just jump from topic to topic, and it's kind of like garbled explanations. But so what they always say, the war was fought over slavery, and it's a very, and it does go back to the war because these are flags from the war, right? Or, well, a little bit before the war, right? But they always go back to this sort of elementary school, kindergarten or first grade explanation of the war. It was the South fighting to keep slavery and the North fighting to get rid of slavery. No real historian or person that understands history will believe that because they know it's much more complicated. And you would have to have a child's mentality to believe such a thing. And like I've tried to tell people, I say, well, if the Confederate banner represents the defense of if it represents the defense of the institution of slavery, people defending slavery, and to a large extent it does, because you were with slave states, right? Not all the slave states, because Kentucky and Delaware chose to stay in the Union. Missouri probably would have voted to withdraw, but they had U.S. occupation of the state before they were allowed to vote. Same thing with Maryland. It was very almost certain that Maryland would vote to secede, but the U.S. government occupied the state and arrested the legislators before they could vote to secede, land of the free. But these were slave states that wanted to protect it. But you have to go back further in history and to understand the whole context of it. We have to go back to 1775, when the 13 colonies began to revolt against Great Britain. And I did a video beforehand where I talked about how I did not favor, by studying the secession movement of 1775, I clearly did not favor breaking away against the government of King George III Hanover, the King of Great Britain and the 13 colonies. He's portrayed as some evil guy that was trying to repress the colonies, but in reality, he was not an evil guy, and he wasn't trying to repress the colonies. In fact, when you get down to the root of that story, it was just they wanted to break away. And all these so-called tyrannies were just pretexts or excuses. It wasn't really any tyranny. But the left-wing guys will always say in the newspaper, they write these letters, they're always kind of hysterical tone. The letters will say, these Southerners were traitors. They were traitors to America because they broke away from the great America. Well, if you use that same logic, then the founding, and these same people will celebrate the 4th of July, Independence Day. Well, then the people that broke away from Great Britain were traitors because they broke away from the king, who they actually made a solemn oath to. And they say, well, also treason is taking up arms against the United States. Well, these people took up arms against the king. All right, so you have to use some logic. There has to be a logical thread, right? So if treason means breaking away from a country that you're part of, then the people that broke away in 1775/76 were treason. They were traitors. They fought against the king. They were stockpiling guns to fight against the king. That's why they had the raid at Lexington and Concord. So if they were traitors in 1861, then they were traitors in 1775. Now, another argument they'll use is, well, they attacked Fort Sumter first. The South fired first. Once again, that's an elementary school argument. There would have never been an attack on Fort Sumter had Lincoln simply evacuated the fort and let South Carolina secure their state assets. But he wanted to bait the South into firing first so he could claim that the South started it. He was a very smart person. I didn't say he was a good person. I didn't say he was a moral person. I said he was a smart person. And he knew they were kind of hot-headed, and they took the bait. A big mistake. I said that in a previous video. Secession was a mistake. Well, what is the first thing the 13 colonies did when they rose up against the British? They secured all their colonial assets, and after 1776, they declared themselves state assets. First thing they did, they attacked Fort Ticonderoga, and they captured all the weapons to use against the British Army in Boston. So, of course, all the 13 colonies secured their assets when they began to rise up against the British. So, of course, the 11 states who seceded, at first it was 7. It was only 11 after Lincoln ordered the attack on the South, and 4 other states couldn't, like they said, it would be against their honor to allow foreign troops to march through their states into fellow Southern states. So they couldn't honorably, like Virginia, the state of Virginia was anti-secession, but it was against their honor. They could not allow such a, I don't know what the word is, such a dishonorable thing to occur. or disrespectful thing to occur. So, but now we have to go back again. You know, you want to talk about slavery. Well, I don't think there's too many people championing slavery, but we're talking about 1787. We're not talking about 1987. So in 1787, after they decided that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate, there was the meeting in Philadelphia, the Constitutional Convention, and the states agreed, after a series of compromises, that they would form on what they called a more perfect union, a tighter union. And this book is a collection of articles called The Federalist, and it explains, it was written by John Jay, James Monroe, and Alexander Hamilton. It explains the arguments for a more perfect union, the Constitution. And there's a whole bunch of, the whole book is a series of questions and answers. You know, like questions like, well, what if the US government is too powerful? And they go into all these, they don't teach this much in school. They talk, you know, they'll mention it, but every good government and history department should require the students to read this book. Because in a lot of ways, it argues towards the Confederate secessionist viewpoint. No one was really at the convention saying, well, we ought to get rid of slavery. There was never a point of contention that we're going to get rid of slavery in 1787. Some people didn't like it. Some people did like it. Most people there probably were indifferent to it. Of course, half the states would have never joined the Union if they had thought that down the road the game would be changed and they would be somehow ordered to get rid of slavery. They wouldn't have had a United States. Or if they would have had a United States, it would have been only 7 states. And they would have had a Southern Confederation and been 2 different countries, which probably would have maybe been better and could have avoided 600 to 1 million people being killed in by 1865 after the war. So maybe that would have been a better way. But at the time they thought, well, we could work this out. We can work it out, like the Beatles. Oh, wait, they didn't work it out. But anyway, you understand, we can work it out. So one thing that was embedded into the Constitution, well, there were 2 things. One thing was that everybody pretty much agreed that the slave trade was a dirty business, bringing slaves in from Africa, not to mention that they wanted the country to be a mostly white country. So the northern states especially didn't really like the idea of more blacks coming in, you know, like when they settled the West, the western states, the free soil movement was very, you know, strident that this should be a white man's territory. They didn't want blacks coming out. And if you brought slaves out there, then that means you brought blacks out there. So that was a big part of that. That's not really talked about today, but that was a big part of it. So, but they agreed that 20 years to the day after the Constitution was ratified, the US government could restrict or abolish the slave trade, not slavery. So in fact, that is what was done. 1788, the Constitution was ratified, and in 1808, the slave trade was outlawed. People in the South did not squawk about it because they had actually agreed to it. They didn't mind. Okay. There was some question about what happens if slaves escape into free states. I mean, they'll just all run away. How can we protect our property? That's what the Southerners said. Well, Article 4, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, you can read it for yourself. It says that if slaves escape from the South, they have to be returned to the state from which they escaped. This is part of the Constitution, or at least until the 13th Amendment. So for a slave to escape from a state into another state, he was actually committing an unconstitutional act. For anyone to harbor the slave and refuse to return him, he was committing an unconstitutional act. So this was a guarantee that slaves could not escape. I'll read it to you. I have it right here. No person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, in other words, the state from which he escapes, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall he or she shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. See what I'm saying? No person held to service or labor in one state, say Louisiana, under the laws thereof, Louisiana said slavery was allowed, escaping into another, say Ohio, shall, in the consequence of any law or regulation therein, the laws of Ohio, slavery not allowed, be discharged from service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. So in other words, if you escape into a free state, you have to be returned. But what it developed? We have the abolitionist movement. People like William Lloyd Garrison up there in Massachusetts. Well, he had enough sense to know what the Constitution said, so he decided that the Constitution was evil because it protected slavery. So he burned the Constitution. He said he hated the United States of America, and he would rather see the whole country break apart than slavery continue. Most people thought he was a nut. He didn't get a lot of attention, but that over the years, and he started in the 1830s, over the years that movement grew, this abolitionist movement grew. So see, now there's a problem developing because slaves would escape into the North and they would not be returned. And so this caused endless controversy between the states, because the southern states say, no, you have to follow the Constitution, because if you would try to suddenly say that no, slaves are not going to be returned to the slave states, then that would invalidate the Constitution. In fact, it would void it. The Constitution would be void. Of course, it would be void. If you violate the clause of a contract, the contract is void. And there was a feeling in the South that the contract was being voided by the growing agitation of the abolitionists. And look, this came to a head with John Brown, his raid on Virginia, today part of West Virginia, Harper's Ferry. And there was this attempt to have a slave uprising across the South. And then when he was executed by the U.S. government for treason, well, there was so much sympathy in the North. There wasn't universal sympathy, but there was a lot of sympathy, especially in the New England states, to this not really a terrorist, more like a revolutionary, right? Ringing church bells. And this was reported down south that some towns were ringing church bells and they were writing poems and songs. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave. That's when, and then Lincoln was elected by the, he was a Republican, which was seen as the abolitionist party. And that's the party that the abolitionists tended to gravitate towards. Lincoln was not an abolitionist, by the way. He never said we need to abolish slavery. He didn't want it to spread out west. He was a free soiler. He never called for the direct abolition of slavery. He thought that down the road it should probably be phased out. He wanted to keep the Union together, of course, dominated by the North. He was a Northerner. He didn't want that Southern wealth leaving. And he had no qualms about going to war to keep, it's like an angry husband. The wife says, I'm leaving. He says, I'll kill you before you leave. And that's the situation we have in 1861. The Southern states, they're like the wife that says, I don't like the way this marriage is going. I feel like you're gonna hurt me. You're already starting to hurt me. I got hit a little bit. I'm out of here. And the angry husband says, I'll kill you before you leave. And in fact, does kill her before she leaves or tries to leave. Now, Lincoln wasn't exactly the angry husband. He was more like the calculating husband. Now, we're going to kill her, but we're going to make it look like she started it or she was asking for it. The bitch was asking for it. You know what I mean? That you got to portray it that way. So, in the South, which was a much weaker part of the U.S. of America, they knew the odds were stacked against them. They had much less industry, less population, all of this stuff. So they lost. They fought very well. They came close to pulling it off, certainly. Did a lot better than many people thought. We all know the history, though. They lost. Okay, South lost. They lost. It's over. They lost. But they built the monuments to memorialize those who had fought for the Confederacy. And most Southerners did not own slaves. Of course, most Southerners were not favorable towards equal rights or civil rights or integration or any of that. We understand that Lincoln himself, he's on the penny and other monuments across the country. Lincoln himself said that he would never favor blacks being equal to whites. And his pet project was to actually export all the blacks or deport blacks back to Africa, because he didn't think the white culture and the black culture were compatible. This is not talked about too much either, although it's the truth. So if we have to get rid of the Confederate flag because it defended slavery, then logically you would say the U.S. flag, the stars and stripes, should be eliminated because it also stood for the defense of slavery between 1775 really and 1865, because Kentucky had slavery up until the 13th Amendment was, well, I think they did a state law to get rid of it before, but it was legal. The Emancipation Proclamation, Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, and all the Confederate areas that had been conquered by the U.S. already, like St. John the Baptist Parish, Orleans Parish, they were exempt from the Emancipation Proclamation. Slaves were not freed in those areas. It's just another point to bring up. So the U.S. government, the Constitution, we're always taught to love the Constitution. You should love the Constitution. Protected slavery. The stars and stripes, people say, I pledge allegiance to the flag, to the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, the flag of the United States of America. I know how to say it, don't worry. And to the republic for which it stands. Also, you could say, and to the institution of slavery for which it defended for decades. It'd be accurate to say that. And to Lincoln, who said he would take the country with all the slaves freed, he would take the Union with half the slaves freed, or he would take the Union with none of the slaves freed, as long as the Union was kept together. That was his paramount goal. He wasn't exactly a Martin Luther King Jr. type civil rights leader now, was he? But why bring up these troublesome little viewpoints, these troublesome little facts? I'm sorry, a viewpoint is how you see it. These troublesome facts about history. Well, I think it's important. Lee Circle is still in New Orleans. Jefferson Davis statue is still in New Orleans. Now you got these little crazy, you talk about the crazies on the right, you have them, they're around. You got the crazies on the left, these provocateurs, they want to go defacing the statues of Robert E. Lee or Jefferson Davis. Now, that's a very bad idea, because then you get the crazies on the right. They'll go, you know what they're going to do. They're going to deface cherished statues of the liberal world, and we know what those statues are. And so we don't want all these people getting all worked up and out of control and violent and everything. So my viewpoint. You've seen my videos. I am always for peace today, peace tomorrow, and peace forever. I'm anti-war. I'm anti-violence to the hilt, probably to a fault. So we want peace. We want amity. We want all the races to live together and fellowship. But these ridiculous things like taking the Confederate flag off the General Lee, the car in the Dukes of Hazzard, all these politically correct, knee-jerk, and frankly insulting things that people do. They're embarrassing. For Mitch Landrieu is an embarrassing person anyway. Before all of this started, in a lot of ways, his whole family is sort of embarrassing. But he's embarrassing himself worse, you see, with these pandering that he does. But you expect the lefty to act leftist. It's even more embarrassing for people like Nimrata Haley and Robert Brantley and Rick Perry and Randy Paul and who's the guy, Jeb Bush, and all these other guys to run around talking about, oh, we ought to take down that flag. all they're doing is pandering. These people are so so very unsavory, but they want to be elected president of the United States. Well, one of them will be elected. You got Hillary Clinton on the on one end, and so it's like, do you want to take really strong poison or just some strong poison? Well, I don't want to get into the election coming up, but I'm arguing with people all the time, and I'm saying, so what you're telling me is you want to take some sort of poison. I don't think you should take poison. All right, well, thank you for watching this video production. I hope this short, relatively short video explains some things, and I'd be interested to discuss it with people, because I think talking about things is much better than hollering, screaming about it, unfriending people about it, blocking people about it. That's baby cry. I don't like the baby cry approach. You know, you want to get onto the ball court and you want to play hard, but then you want to take your ball and go home when you can't play the game. No, you have to man up, or woman up. Just learn to discuss. Thank you.